future is a concept. It doesn't exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds Podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about.
And other things.
All right, our guest tonight is a highly respected and highly invested individual in the study and practice of Western spiritual traditions. He's the author of a plethora of books, of which include Egregores, The Path of Alchemy, Kabbalah for Health and Wellness, Between the Gates, Child of the Sun, Mind of Hermes. I can keep going on and on. He is the founder and director of studies at the Institute for Hermetic Studies as well. He is Mark Stavish. It's truly a joy for me to be having you here this evening, Mark. So yeah, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. So to start it off, I wanted to touch on the philosophers of nature and Jean Dubuis. I was hoping we could kind of start here. I don't know a whole lot about Jean Dubuis and very little about the organization called the Philosophers of Nature, but I think that you may be able to lend a little bit of insight into kind of who he was and maybe give a general rundown of who the philosophers of nature were. So yeah, I was hoping we can kind of touch on that to start it off.
Oh, sure. Well, Jean Dubuis was a French alchemist and Kabbalist. He was a engineer by profession. Excuse me. He founded the Philosophers of Nature in 1978 and put an expiration date on it of 22 years. So it ended in 2000 officially. The organization was initially composed, in France at least, of quite a few members of Amorc France, because Jean was quite well placed in the Rosicrucian order Amorc of the French jurisdiction. Many people believe that it really was preferable that he would have been the Grand Master of that jurisdiction than the man who eventually would be, which was Raymond Bernard. Raymond Bernard has been dead quite a few years now. I don't remember the exact date. And his son, Christian Bernard, would eventually take over that role, kind of in an inherited way. And up until, I believe, a year or two ago, Christian Bernard was head of the worldwide organization in the role of imperator, as they call it. So Jean was quite the fellow. He ran what was probably the largest Martinist heptad, or lodge, for lack of a different term, in Paris. That was under the TMO, or Traditional Martinist Order. And it was large because he was not only a very skilled instructor, but as a very skilled Kabbalist, he provided information and ideas that were, of course, beneficial to the members. Rumor has it, and I've heard this from, well, he himself, but also others as well. You get a slightly different story when different people tell it, kind of the same angles. That, as many people know, Martinism had many different groups or variations, and there's always attempts at unity. So sometime, I believe in the 70s, the date is not clear to me, might have been a little earlier, he was asked, because many people respected him, to perform their famous Yeshua ceremony. Now, the Yeshua ceremony, of course, is under the what's called the Pentagrammaton, or the five-lettered word, meaning Yod He Shin Vav He, for those who are into Kabbalah. And this is supposedly a powerful name for invoking the powers of Tifereth, or Christ, or however the school wants to interpret it. Now, that's important to know, because this ritual is done near Christmas of each year. Not exactly on it, but near it. So it's kind of a solstice Christmas ritual. And that said that when he did it, because he was such a ritualistic perfectionist and could actually bring the inner essence to the ritual, not just the outer form, that several of the high-ranking officers sitting in the the north, in the southeast, which is the place of honor for guests, began to get nosebleeds. And anyone who's familiar with the stories around that know that that means that the psychic pressure in the room was quite high, so that he could really pull off a ritual, as it were, and not just in the formal sense of going through the motions, but in the actual operative sense. You could actually get a sense of elevation temporarily from it. So that's kind of a glimpse into who he was. And of course, operative alchemy was his other specialty, particularly as an engineer. And there wasn't a lot going on at that time. We had the remains of Frater Albertus's school in the mid 80s. And that is, at least it operated in Australia. It ceased to function as an entity in the United States, I believe, in 85 or 86, somewhere in there. And many of the students of Albertus, who also learned alchemy in Amorc in the 40s, part of it, I should say, flocked to him. Now, of course, many of those students were members of Amorc, or at least in the U.S. jurisdiction, the English Grant Lodge. It's called English Language Grant Lodge at the time. So you had a lot of Amorc people in the Philosophers of Nature, and a lot of people who crossed over to the Paracelsus Society, Paracelsus Research College of Albertus. And they kind of formed the core nucleus of what would be the Philosophers of Nature, which was, at first was LPN, the French term. Then it was LPN USA. And then they did a full translation of the Philosophers of Nature, organizationally speaking. Quite a few of the original officers are still around, and you can hear them on YouTube or in other presentations that they do. The organization was never terribly large in the United States, but it did have a good core group of people and produced a great deal of useful information material that has been widely used and disseminated ever since.
Wow. Yeah, I think I was kind of pointed in the direction of a text called The Fundamentals of Esoteric Knowledge. But yeah, that's interesting. And I don't know if this is true. So I'd read that in 99 that the association was sort of dissolved because Dubuis had felt that it's strayed from its core principles. Is this accurate to your knowledge, or?
No, that's not true.
No.
He put an actual expiration date on it.
Okay. That makes sense then. And so yeah.
I mean, how could it stray? He was in charge.
Right. That's a good point.
Just let me point something out there that, a lot of that stuff happens early and people get these rumor mills going.
Right.
And I find myself being asked to answer them and answer them more than once. And probably the most ludicrous rumor related in a way to this is, along Joe Leshevsky, they're saying that like he wasn't a real person. And I'm like, I wrote the introductions to his book. I wrote the introduction to the book. It's a real person.
Well, that's why guys like you are the ones to ask, because you know firsthand. So that's why an outsider like me, I come to this closest to the sources I can get.
Well, that's a wise thing to do, because you'll find even that there's a lot of folks who will just continue not to believe. But that is the story. I mean, the Philosophers of Nature had an expiration date. The rights to the information was given to Russ House, who was, I think, the last president of the organization. And he and his wife, Sue, established Triad Publishing to continue keeping the material published. And then, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, I'd have to look at the dates, Triad, was dissolved, and the material is freely available online.
Thank God for them doing that, because it's much appreciated.
Yes.
So Egregores, this is something I've been kind of interested in for a long time, as I've been doing graphic design for about 18 years or so, and I only recently discovered that word. within the last couple of years or so, but I think it helps kind of lend some understanding to some related phenomena. Because so I've heard you differentiate between like a thought form and an egregore by the notion that an egregore is dependent upon growth, or at least requires being sustained by a driving philosophical ambition of some kind. And as you may have said, like within a group context in particular, or at least the egregore would require a multitude of like attentive nodes to sort of sustain its form. And with that in mind, I wanted to get your thoughts on egregores in relation to like sigils, or how they may be able to perpetuate and amplify like an egregore. Like, so my question and my curiosity is, in your estimation, to what extent may something like a business logo or a company symbol carry the charge of any particular egregore? Or, and then like, to what level of psychic potency is a symbol or sigil able to transmit that information on a subconscious level? Do you know what I mean by that?
Anytime we're dealing with an egregore, to some degree, we're dealing with a thought form. And the easiest way to distinguish is I can have a thought form and it's mine. It belongs to me. When two or more are gathered together in my name, then we have a potential of an egregore. So an egregore is always a group phenomena, a group activity. That's it. Now, you can be a part of that group in a different way. You may be an official card-carrying member, or you may just be someone who is somehow fascinated by the ideas and principles of that group. And it can be anything. It can be your local bowling league. Okay? It doesn't have to be deeply philosophical, at least as we understand it. What it has to have is a powerful attraction for its members. Then those organizations have some connection on an inner level to various archetypal energies. And this is where cultists really either show their knowledge or their lack thereof. You know, when we look at the doctrine of correspondences, you know, and the relationship of things, you know, everything is going to be a combination of different energies or qualities. So my local bowling league, my softball team after work, you know, those are martial qualities. Those are Mars. They're sports. They're competitive. They're mercurial. Okay. So you got some Mars and Mercury in there. How that energy may relate individually is different. The company softball team is there to reinforce company morale. So it's to essentially focus on that sense of belongingness and identification with the company, beyond the idea of my 8-hour day, 40-hour week. So the more we identify with something bigger than us, so to speak, the more we're talking about involvement with an egregore. And that identification can be temporary, such as when we do assumption of the God form in ritual magic. Or it can be more permanent, where we identify wholly and completely with maybe our occupation or our family history or our place of origin or anything, you know, for that matter. So strength of identification and multiple members is critical to the egregore. Now, how does this work with sigils? Well, sigils or any symbol become a focal point of psychic energy, mental concentration, even just attention. Remember, when we talk about psychic attention, we're dealing with everything from a glancing thought to full-on visualization and dedicated practice, and the whole spectrum in between. You know, all of that is food or energy or sustenance, so to speak, for the force or ideas behind the symbol. but there has to be force and ideas behind the symbol, because a sigil in and of itself has questionable value. You have to build up something around it. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of lines on a piece of paper. I mean, we all talk about the sigils involved in Golden Dawn practices derived from the Hermetic Rose Cross. Well, that's nice, but I haven't seen any version of the Hermetic Rose Cross, that predates the Golden Dawn or the period before it, slightly before it. I mean, it may be out there, but I haven't seen it. So this idea of creating this mechanism or tool, which we call the Hermetic Rose Cross, whereupon which we can link the letters to form of the names to form graphic representations of the energies, that's relatively new, that expression of it at least. And it doesn't work by rote. I mean, it's not as if you and I can do this and it just works. There has to be an emotional connection to it. There has to be a force and a drive and a desire behind it. Now, the point is that when we have an egregore, the idea is that we're creating some kind of psychic reservoir of power, something that exists in some nondescript fourth dimension that we can tap into or others can tap into. And then the question is, does it tap into us? And of course, it does to the degree that we identify with it and give ourselves over to it. Just as people may give themselves completely over to their work identity, their careers, their political beliefs, their religious beliefs, anything.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, so say like with that example of that softball team, they create a logo perhaps, and that kind of represents that egregore. Would you say that the overall experiences of the culture within that company and how they're kind of emanating around that logo, would that kind of embed some kind of psychic energy into that? And then if, say, somebody was in passing, was to glance at that logo, would that carry some potential subconscious energy over, perhaps? Like, could it be transmitted on some level, or does it not quite work like that?
In theory, yes. However, there has to be a connection.
Okay.
Because if you don't understand what that logo means to some degree, if it doesn't have enough of a graphic quality to it to elicit some kind of emotional response, nothing's going to happen. Now, a perfect example is the logo you have for Philosophical Minds. It's clearly designed on a lot of classical imagery, and it's designed to elicit an emotional response. The logo for ESO gas is not. Now, if you see that logo, it's not going to elicit a response to you unless you have some idea of what it is. And you've been driving maybe in the Nevada desert, and you realize that you have passed all other gas stations and you're about to go on empty. And ESO shows up ahead in the brilliant light in the distance. And now suddenly the emotional response is, thank you, hallelujah, hallelujah, we're saved. So in that sense, it might. Or if you didn't know what that was, and then you finally came upon it and said, oh, it's a gas station. Oh, and now forevermore, ESO is your gas of choice because it kept you from being, vulture food in the desert.
All right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I've heard you talk about the conception of an egregore as also like a kind of a social control mechanism, as you've described before. Could you elaborate a little bit on like what you mean by control in that sense, and kind of like the functionality of control in regards to a particular egregore?
Well, it's like anything, you go to school and you go to college and you're going to major in engineering. There's only so many English lit classes you can take and still graduate as an engineer. There's bumpers. And we can expand that to spiritual practices. There's only so many things you can study and so many things you can practice and make any progress. At some point, you've got to narrow your focus and get involved in a particular series of practices if you want to go anywhere that is make any progress in self-awakening, self-realization, and apply that. So egregores aren't in and of themselves inherently negative, but they can become problematic for us if they become all-consuming. Whereas the individual identifies so heavily with their spiritual beliefs or practices, their religious beliefs, their political beliefs, that that becomes their end all be all, and that they're willing to jettison anyone who is not of it, to adhere to that doctrinal and philosophical view and purity, to create an environment free of any questioning or difference of opinion, or even, again, the key point is even questioning of the possibilities of there being another view or a different opinion.
Yeah, I've heard you use the example of, say, like the military or something, for example. I really like it because it seems like it kind of illustrates it well. Somebody who joins and they kind of get caught up in that notion of, say, going to war, not necessarily for reasons that make sense, but because they're just caught up in that sort of egregore, if you would.
Well, people join the military for a variety of different reasons, and very rarely is it patriotism, and that's just the fact that many people don't want to understand. And when you don't have many options in front of you, I think it was Mike Tyson who said, boxing is what you do when you can't do anything else. And it's the same thing with joining the military. I mean, you're putting your life on the line. That doesn't say there aren't people who are patriotic about it or don't have family history that they're continuing and have different views about it. However, most of the people that I know, they were doing it for the money. And there weren't career options for them. This was going to give them money for education. This is going to give them an opportunity to move on, or maybe even form a career within the military itself. So, and this is across the world. That needs to be understood. That's widely done. That's just across the world. So when you enter into that domain of the professional military, the professional killing machine, which is what it is, there's certain things that you have to consciously and unconsciously sign on for. And that stays with you very often. And it's no different in anything else. It's just more obvious there. Contemporary spirituality, contemporary esotericism, is filled with a lot of similar assumptions about what one buys into when they join it. That's why we've seen so much discontent among, we'll say, Western occultism in the last 4 to 6 years, 8 years, in the last 2 in particular. There's, wide sale assumptions about what it means and what it's about and what you're buying into. Many of which aren't true, but it's just they're there anyhow. So there's a variety of egregores out there. Military is just easiest to see. Politics is easiest to see. It's very difficult often to see the ones that we may be involved in because they appeal to our ideals. Just as the military does, it appeals to your ideals. Look, you're down and out. You need money. You need career opportunities. You need, chance for education. Serve your country. It's a win-win. I mean, really, it is a win-win in that regard. Assuming everything works out for you. But that manipulation of ideals is also done in various occult groups all the time.
Now, I've heard you discuss this fascinating notion of consciously created egregores by the priesthood back in the day. And so now I'm wondering, do we have like actual historical literature that describes some of these conscious efforts on behalf of the priest class? And did they use the word egregore themselves to describe this, or did the word kind of originate out of some outside observations of this phenomena? Or just what do you think about all that?
Yeah, to my knowledge, the word existed, but the way we're using it is probably relatively new. The ideas existed, so everything is a duck test. Remember, you got, does it look like a duck, quack like a duck, walk like a duck? Okay, the duck test is what we need to use. And we see this formation of group identity and appeal to group power and the use of group thought and the limitation of possibilities in all systems. Some are just spectacularly wonderful at it. I mean, when we look at Tibetan Buddhism, they tried to create an isolated country totally focused on various aspects of Vajrayana. And then within the country, various groups, factions attempted to create their own superior forms. And sometimes this struggle would be quite violent. And they've done so good at creating their own public relations that many people, particularly converts, don't even understand just how violent some of that intersectarian warfare was, even until recently. So they're wonderfully good at the egregore. They're fantastic at it. They excel at it. We can see some political actions that are good at it as well. In other religious movements. Fundamentalist Islam is spectacular at it. Catholicism was pretty good at it and was even better. Now, not so much, but it used to be really good at it. So, I mean, just if we want to look at everything from a historical, verifiable, can we find it written down perspective, then there's a lot of things we're never going to know.
Definitely.
So we have to use the duck test for a lot of things, and this is one of them.
What would you say that some of the primary uses in terms of Catholicism in particular were in their creation of particular egregores? What kind of function and role did they play, and what was the intention behind them that they were trying to elicit?
The function and role is the same as any other. I mean, to create a mechanism of to some degree limitation. And it can also be with very good intentions. That is, this is a path to salvation in a very short, cold, brutal, and violent world. And this is going to help you get to where you need to go. So we're going to keep you focused only on this. Now, if you as an individual had the capacity to stay focused only on this, then, these groups wouldn't be needed. In the Indian mythologies, you have Hanuman. And Hanuman is focused only on Rama. Focused only on Rama. That's it. Well, if you could have that same level of focus on your deity or ideal of choice, as we're told, that then enlightenment or liberation will be yours. But many people don't have that degree of focus. So they come together and through their collective efforts have that potential to have some degrees of realization. And then as those collective efforts become more organized and more standardized, and that's in many places as well, then you see that function of control mechanism where bureaucracy gets set up, and again, not necessarily good or bad, but someone's deciding as a gatekeeper what stays and what goes, what's allowed in and what isn't. And then we get into that domain of what constitutes heresy or heterodoxy or something of that nature. And that's, again, true in many places, not just Catholicism.
Definitely. wanted to talk with you about theurgy versus something like a goetic practice. What is the difference there?
I think just on a practical level, fundamentally, we're saying that the theurgist is, and this is again speaking very broadly, there's always room for disagreement here, seeking to unite themselves with either their holy guardian angel or their daemon or their vision and notion of divine purity in the sense of divine purity, not kind of a moral or ethical purity, but just untainted. This is it. This is boom. This is reality as it is. Whereas and they are transformed in this process. They are deified in this process. Keep that in mind. They are risen to the ranks of the heroes. They themselves become deified. Whereas in goetic practice, the tendency is to focus on the bringing forth of various entities into a manifestation. Some insist that it must be visible, others don't, but generally the general rule is that it must be controlled manifestation. And that these goetic forces tend to be more chthonic, more difficult, more wild, possibly even hostile to the magician. And the operator there is generally looking for some kind of practical benefit. And maybe wisdom, it may be knowledge, it may be power, it may be authority, it may be something very technical in a technical world, such as science or mathematics or even arts or languages or diplomacy or war. But it's concerned really about what we would call the mundane world in some form, generally speaking. Whereas theurgy, generally speaking, has a certain aspect of transcendence to it.
Now, you wrote a piece, I believe, that I think it's something along the lines of even angels can be douchebags. And I would think maybe demons, yes, but angels too, yeah? Could you elaborate a little bit on this?
Well, when we talk about these invisible beings, they have a different hierarchy than we do. It's a hierarchy of power. And power is de facto authority and de facto wisdom. There's no knowledge without power and no power without knowledge in that domain. And generally speaking, if you go to the angelic beings and the look for help, they'll tend to have your best interests at heart. And this is, remember, very broadly speaking here, trying to be very simple in the explanation. So they treat you as a child, as a parent would a child. Your best interests at heart. So you may not get what you want. You may not get it when you want it. Whereas the demonic forces, they don't have your best interests at heart, and they're always looking for a loophole out. So you are treated like an adult. Is this what you want? Yes. Are you sure? Yes. Are you absolutely positive? Yes. Boom, there it is. Now, if your life goes to crap afterwards because you didn't think through the details of the possible ramifications of it, that's not their problem, nor concern. Now, if you buy a Maserati and you can't make the payments on it, that's not my problem. And if you end up in a collision with it because you don't know how to drive it, that's certainly not the salesperson's problem. You came in with the money and the license and proof of insurance, and okay, now you're expected to know how to handle that thing. So we have to look at what are these forces, these different aspects of being or beings in the universe, of which humans are one aspect, animals are another. We can say ghosts are another. We can look at these beings that are in the hell, that suffer. We can look at these demons that are truly hostile to us in many ways. We can look at the so-called angels that are beneficial, the gods, deities, enlightened beings, saints, what have you. And they all have their own agendas. I mean, human beings, particularly modern magic, likes to think that you can just snap your fingers and these things are going to willingly do your bidding for you because they've got nothing else to do. Think of the arrogance in that. So if you keep insisting on certain things, depending on what your karmic propensities are, you may get a lesson taught to you. And that's your own fault. You brought it on yourself. And that lesson can come from, as we said, can come from these less than desirable forces, which I kind of give the analogy. They're like the gangsters of the universe, like the loan sharks. Well, because it's very similar. What do you think is the psychic force behind criminal entities? Well, when you see criminal entities, all you're looking at is the physical expression of those demonic forces.
Absolutely. Now, you had mentioned hell, heaven and hell. Many people have all kinds of ideas about heaven and hell. What are yours? Like, what is your idea of heaven or hell? Are they actually physical locations? Are they dimensional? Yeah, just anything. What are your thoughts about all that?
Well, there's many different types of heavens and hells. I mean, you want to go to hell, just go to your average Ethiopian refugee camp in the 80s. You want to go to hell? Go to Cuba. You want to see suffering? Go to hell? Go to Haiti.
So would you see it as sort of a state of an experiential state that anybody has the potential to come in and out of contact with? Something along those lines?
Just as you have the potential to come in and out of contact with a host of states of awareness. Right. You exist, you have the potentiality of a broad spectrum of states of awareness. What happens is people get very narrowed in on just one or two. And spiritual systems can keep people very narrowly sucked in too, thinking only in terms of, these heavenly realms, and within that framework, a very narrow sense of what these heavenly realms are like. Whether it's you get your 72 virgins or something like that, you can have a very narrow sense of it. And that reflects, of course, that your degree of your own self-awareness and self-understanding. In Asia, the majority of Buddhist practices, if I remember correctly, are what are called Pure Land practices. And simply that's a devotional practice designed to take you to what is essentially a heavenly realm on death. So that you can receive some teaching or insight in that dimension and carry that with you in the event of your reincarnation and to keep you moving forward.
Now, King Solomon. Solomon has always been a fascinating figure to me. And there's an Egyptian text called The Instructions of Amenanope, and it has some strikingly similar content to the book of Proverbs of Solomon. And yeah, they're very similar. So I think it kind of brings up a lot of questions. And then Solomon allegedly was born in, I think, 990 BC, and then he dies in 931. Amenanope is the pharaoh of the 21st dynasty, ruled during 1001 to 992 BC. So although the instructions of Amenanope were said to be composed 1300 to 1075, and this is just me researching online. I don't know all of this for a fact. I'm just looking at what I can find. But either way, Yeah, the instructions of Amenenope, they predate the Proverbs. So there's a lot of possibilities here and plausible connections. And I wonder what you may make of that. And if you know any further information regarding Solomon, the origins of his work with things like Solomon's Keys and so on. Also, is it your understanding that Solomon was an actual physical human being or no?
These folks were neighbors. There was a vast exchange across the Silk Roads. And this not only went from east to west, but also all the neighboring territories of trade. So when we're looking at something to say, well, who begat who, essentially, it can be very interesting and informative to us, but may not necessarily add a great deal to our personal practice. So we have to make sure that the historical information we're seeking out provides us with a tool, and that tool simply can be a more flexible mind, a more open mind. But to say that this is who King Solomon was is dangerous, because we don't know. We have information, but we don't know where that information came from. What if that which survived happened to be the equivalent of I don't know, like Reader's Digest or something of the day. It's just a synopsis,
Very well could be, yeah.
meant for popular reading. Or what if it's just the equivalent of like one of the trashy magazines or newspapers you find at the the checkout line in the grocery store? So we have to be careful about what we quickly want to believe. That's why I focus a great deal on what is useful to practice and what are you practicing and where is it taking you? What is it preparing you for? Because there's some wonderful research out there on the myth of Solomon, the man, the myth, the legend, the magician, all these things, and how they create an egregore. And that egregore is the myth that survives from generation to generation. And then texts are attributed to him. And he didn't write them, but the legend is so strong that's that force, that Solomonic force, if you want to call it that, permeates them and spreads through them. So at the end of the day, questions like this I find interesting, and I'll read an essay or two on it, but I don't trouble myself with them. I'm only concerned with what is my practice, where did it come from, how do I perform it, what will it do for me while I'm alive, and what will it do for me when I'm dead? That's pretty much it.
I think that's a healthy response. And speaking of practices, Masonry. So these days, Masons often take a tremendous beating by some of the more conspiratorial related authors and podcasters out there. And I'm sure that there have been many corrupt Masons who have conspired for purposes of ill will, but like any and all large groups, I don't think that it's representative of the group as a whole. And I think I was guilty of falling prey to this assumption myself until, I discovered guys like Manly P. Hall, and I was like, wow, I could listen to this guy talk all day. And there's, modern day guys I like Randall Carlson, who I really enjoy listening to. But yeah, Masonry, it's a pretty mysterious system for many. And I'm wondering if you can give your take on it and kind of like the essence of what it is, what it has been historically up until its modern manifestations, kind of just your general gist of Masonry.
Well, Masonry is a big banner. It's a very large tent under which many different activities and organizations exist. When we speak of Freemasonry, we're speaking primarily of what we call Blue Lodge, or the first 3 degrees, wherein one is a master mason at the end, entered apprentice. Uh, then there at first there was only two. There was entered apprentice and then master, but then there's the second degree fellowcraft was added, so we have 3 degrees. And then you have the so-called other degrees off of that in York and Scottish Rite or different rites, but those are considered explanations of those lower 3 or additional information, if you will. And it's in that material that we often see the notion of occult forces and ideas present. And it's true. Many Masons are completely unaware of it. However, it's only because they choose to be. If you simply pay any attention to the wonderful research that goes on in the Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction, particularly the work of Art de Hoyos and others, the relationships of all these vast philosophical, theosophical, hermetic ideas and how they weave their way through several hundred years of Masonic history and experience can be easily discovered. So within that framework, many people like to believe that they were doing something nefarious. And they were. They were meeting in private men of all social groups for the most part and electing their own leaders in a time when none of that was acceptable. So that was quite nefarious. And then you see, of course, the questions about political involvement. And there's well-known aspects of different Masonic groups, whether it be the famous American Revolution or the Boston Tea Party or other organizations as well. But that does not mean that those political involvement was centrally orchestrated by Grand Lodges. It just meant that if you were a man in a certain position of authority with education and you had contact, where most likely were you going to meet similar men? And that was going to be in a Masonic lodge. That's just all there was to it. This is where you're going to meet people and you were going to know that you could trust them. So when we move into the occult revival period of the late 19th century, early 20th century, we see a lot of occultists are also involved in Freemasonry. And the reason for that is that within Masonry, a lot of the ideas and symbols were kept alive, but none of the practices. And that needs to be really clear. Masonry doesn't have practices. It has rituals which it confers, in which members participate in and perform if they choose to, but it doesn't have teachings in the formal sense of practices. So these occult groups, whether they be Martinism, Rosicrucianism, these types of entities, would recruit from Masonry rather than the other way around. They would recruit from Masonry because, of course, they knew that these men were already familiar with the ideas. They could keep a secret. They were trustworthy. They understood ritual and its value and symbolism, and they already had a sense. So they were kind of pre-vetted. But not everybody involved was a Mason by any stretch. And then you have modern people who like to look at Masonic conspiracies, and quite frankly, they're fools. All they need to do is join a lodge. It's that simple, but they choose not to. Instead, they'd rather ramble on to their ideas about things. Just because someone is a Roman Catholic and they're involved in something, it doesn't mean they're involved. The Pope ordered them to do it.
Right.
And you have these fools who, and I say that seriously, they're fools because it's so easy to join a lodge. It's so easy, and they just choose not to. So they'll say, well, you don't know what's going on at the top. Well, that may or not be true, but you know what? Let's just use the duck test. If these folks are so powerful, why do we see their numbers shrinking in the United States? Now, there's also a revival. True, to understand, there is a revival among traditional Masonry and philosophical Masonry in the United States and some other places. But for the most part, it's been on a membership crash for 30 years. Why is it that, buildings are being sold off and lodges merged? That doesn't sound like an all-powerful organization to me. And there's some really wonderful men in Masonry. Um, they do tremendous work, particularly charitable work, through their hospitals, like the Shrine Children's Hospitals and other things. And I have spoken very vocally about my concerns about Masonry and where it falls short. However, I will not tolerate just some of the raw stupid, if I may use that word again, that I hear from people about so-called Masonic conspiracies. And that's all I have to say on it. If you want to
Amen
know
to
what
that.
goes on, go join a lodge. It's not that difficult.
All right. Now, Rosicrucianism. Of the various quote unquote secret societies that I've looked into, I've always gotten a pretty good vibe in general from Rosicrucians. And I only have surface level insight, but overall, I think I just share a lot of similar interests and subject matters. It seems probably more in the realms of the alchemical stuff in particular. And I noticed that you have written a book, Rosicrucianism for the New Millennium. Could we talk a little bit about the book and your take on the Rosicrucian order?
That monograph was an analysis of the Vault of Christian Rosenkreuz, which appears in the Fama Fraternitatis, and it's used as a meditational focal point or meditational chamber. And that's to help individuals who are on that or would like to seek a Rosicrucian path to have some connection to the spirit of Rosicrucianism, or what we call the Egregore. Rosicrucianism itself is very difficult because, you know, it could very easily have been a hoax that got out of control, that took on a life of its own. It very easily could have become a myth that then became a reality when we look at it historically. However, what we know now is that it's nearly inseparable, although it is separate. It is a focal point, a stream, but nearly inseparable from Hermeticism, and some aspects of it from Christian mysticism as well, but not exclusively. So there are many aspects of Rosicrucianism, by the way. We have to keep that in mind. There's what we could think of as a very classical Rosicrucianism, which would be alchemy and Kabbalah. And then there's kind of the Rosicrucianism of the Golden Dawn, which would include Enochian magic. And then there's the Rosicrucianism of Rudolf Steiner. We see the Rosicrucian movements of the Rosicrucian Fellowship, which is focused mainly on astrology. And then we see the Rosicrucianism of the Rosicrucian Order Amorc, probably the largest and most well-known Rosicrucian group. And then there are other smaller Rosicrucian groups or Rosicrucian style groups that may or may not necessarily have that word in their name. Because the focal point is, what is the symbol of the rose and the cross? What does that mean? And it's about our individual awakening, our individual unfoldment or realization, that unfoldment of the rose, and inner silence, and to some degree outer silence too. Keeping things secret, not blabbering too much on social media about things.
I think that's insightful. Do you know anything about the order of Fratres Lucis and or Karl von Eckarthausen? Have you heard that name? There may have been some connection with the Golden Dawn. I might be getting this wrong.
No, Eckarthausen's, I think his book was Cloud Upon the Sanctuary, which was connected to the Rosicrucian stream, the Rosicrucian current of mysticism.
Yes, that's correct. That was my understanding. What about this order of Fratres Lucis? Is this a kind of like a branch off of Rosicrucianism, or?
I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember who wrote a book on that. There's some literature out there on that. I haven't paid any serious attention to it in years, just because I wasn't have the time. I wasn't terribly interested.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, it's more of a historical entity. That's why I wasn't too terribly concerned at the time. But
Yeah.
there's some information out there.
I've only recently stumbled upon Kurt Schausen. One of the things I came across, it was saying that he had joined the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt at one point, but then withdrew his membership because he discovered that the order had only recognized enlightenment through human reason or something along those lines, which I don't know if that's true or not, but I just found it kind of interesting in researching him. But so Mark, I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts. This is a pretty vague question on just the general state of the world right now, and the kind of chaos that seems to be kind of perpetuating, and how you might make sense of all of this in your mind, and maybe a little bit of advice or wisdom that you would maybe share with the listeners.
When we look at the world, it is very easy to look at it in extremely negative terms. And the reason being is that you now have media 24/7 relentlessly telling you how terrible things are. Now, when you look at the world historically, never before have more people been lifted out of poverty. And never before, well, at least until recently, and never before has there been as much freedom and fewer wars. So when we say that the world is such a terrible state, we have to say, compared to what? What are we comparing it to?
Good point.
I mean, if we don't establish our bench line, our benchmark, then we can say anything. The world, and this includes many astral worlds too, exist in duality. So they're going to always go through cycles. And those cycles are going to be very active and very passive. Our job is to not get sucked into those cycles, to be as affected by them as little as possible. That's where astrology comes into play. Where the psychic conditions are of a certain time, they don't cause people to do things. It just draws out of what is already their karmic propensity, whatever is their character habit buried deep down below. It just brings it right out. It doesn't make it happen. It's just the opportunity's ripe. So when we look at the world, we have to say, well, what is it that we want from the world? Why am I here? That's the question you have to ask. Why am I here? Now, in Freemasonry, there's a thing known as a chamber of reflection, and I give a presentation on it in which I say this question asks you one question: why are you here? And what that refers to is when you were in the chamber of reflection, you were asked, why do you want to become a Freemason? So you did this before you were actually initiated into the entered apprentice degree. And your answer was read in the open body of the lodge. Some places still do that, others don't. And this was at a time when being a Freemason was illegal. It could cost you your life. So why are you here? Why do you want to join this club when it's so dangerous? But I always say this also then applies to other things. Why are you here? Why are you here in lodge tonight? Why are you here in what you're doing? Why am I here on this broadcast? Why are you here? And people come to esotericism to try and find an answer to that. In some ways, as if the answer can just be provided to them. They have to discover it. In many ways, previous systems were very clear about why we're here. And if you were to study that system of practice, you were told why you're here. You're here to get enlightenment. You're here to free yourself from, cyclic existence. You're here to get yourself out of suffering, to free yourself from the clutches of the demiurge. You're here to become a fully awake and alive and expressed being in the cosmos. That's why you're here. Okay. So we have to ask ourselves that question. And once you've answered yourself that question, then you become far less concerned with the world not living up to your expectations. It doesn't mean you turn your back on it completely or give up on a lot of things, but if you know why you're here, you're going to focus a lot more on that and getting that done rather than what is not happening elsewhere. Because that may happen regardless of what you do. If you don't have the right pay grade, the right professional position, the right career choice, the right level of contacts and influence, you're just wasting your time being concerned about it. So what is it that you can take control of? I tell my sons that all the time. What can you take control of? Start with the small things. Make your bed in the morning. Clean your room. Do your laundry. Clean your dishes. Those are the small things you can take control of. And in doing so, you take control of your mind, at least for a little bit. And success builds on success. Control of your mind builds on control of your mind. You carry that over into your work. What can I take control of here? And you begin to recognize, what can I influence? What can I not influence? Now, you may be able to influence it later on at some point. You may rise to a position of authority within the organization or the company or politics, or maybe spiritually. You may rise to the great level of a true saint and have powerful psychic capacity to influence things. But that's only going to happen if you answer the question, why are you here? And then you ask yourself the questions about your practice. What is this practice? That is, where did it come from? How do I do it? What will the results be? And results, I say, are what will it do for me when I'm alive, and what will it do for me when I'm dead? And the classical systems always emphasize that last question. Modern systems tend to ignore it. So we have to ask ourselves those questions. Concern for the state of the world is going to be less because you're going to be doing the best you can to make it better.
Indeed. All right, I have a few more questions for you, and then we can wrap it up. So, Archangel seals, do you have any insights into the origins of the composition of things like Archangel seals or like the seal of Solomon? They're all very uniquely designed, like they have a particular style to them, and I'm curious, is there any rhyme or reason to their shapes, or were they just constructed at random? To your knowledge, do you have any insight into any of that?
Well, I'm going to assume that they're not random. They're not just, it's not like putting a monkey down at a typewriter and coming back and seeing if you got Shakespeare. I don't think it's like that. What I believe it to be is that these so-called sigils or seals were either direct visionary perceptions or inspired. When you have enough experience in operative magic, when you have enough experience, you understand the grammar of creating a seal. There's a grammar to it. There's a logic to it, and you get it. And the composition is really the word, not creating, but composing, of how to compose a functional operative seal for talismanic work. It's not that difficult. You just have to know the rules. The advantage of these systems that you're talking about is that those seals have been used and abused and misused for hundreds of years. So they carry a bit of a collective charge to them, in theory, which in theory should be beneficial to the operator. But that charge also works in other ways too. You know, you have to be able to handle the load.
And so, what, in your opinion, what are some of the most authentic sources to be found? I've seen like 3 or 4 different iterations of, say, something like the Seal of Raphael, for example. Do is it something that they all would kind of carry a certain extent of authenticity, or is there one that it has a deeper rooted, more close to the source type aspect to it, in your opinion?
Well, what's the source you're referring to? Are you referring to the source as God, or are you referring to the source as a historical point in time where we point to where pen was put to paper or parchment or bark or something? You know, that notion right there, what is the source that you're referring to? You know, in terms of these beings are thought of in terms of terribly flat two-dimensional terms.
So
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here dressed. I don't have my Scooby-Doo underwear on, you know. I'm wearing jeans. I have a polo shirt on with our team logo on it, Institute for Hermetic Studies, just in case there was video. And here I am. So if there was imagery of me, people could see it. It would be what they understand me to be. Other people would see me when I've done an interview or on television or here on a podcast, where I generally wear a jacket and a shirt, button down, pressed. Occasionally, I even wear a tie. And yes, on occasion, on those outrageously hot nights in July and August when I was doing interviews at midnight in my attic, I was in my Scooby-Doo underwear. That was all me. Which one is the authentic me?
see what you're saying. Now, I get what you're saying, but I'm thinking more along the lines of, because these days people kind of can just slap something together and throw it on the internet with no intention behind it and just attribute it to something. So say, most people have a strong association. They know that the symbol for sulfur is the symbol for sulfur, and that's kind of very potent and understood across large groups of people. Now, if somebody was to just go out there and do a squiggly line and then throw it on the internet and say that this is the symbol for sulfur, most people that would have a knowledge base around that symbol would say, well, historically, and according to most of the people that mostly use that symbol, that is not accurate. This one is the one that has been over time used to represent that. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at, and I don't know if that still applies to what you're saying or not, but yeah, because people can go online and kind of search for different things or look through different books and pull up different results. So I guess I'm more so wondering if there's historically, in particular, certain symbol systems that have a more widely understood use and or potency to them. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
well, of course they do, but that doesn't mean just because they're widely understood or may or may not have more potency for them, doesn't mean they're any more or less authentic. I mean, you understand that the occult, the fabrication of occult books was an industry.
Right.
Okay, so you're believing that this book is authentic just because it's 300 or 400 years old.
Okay. So then with that being said, something like I guess you said that there is a type of grammar to creating these symbols. And I guess if one was to learn that grammar, they could essentially create their own symbol
That's
system.
correct.
All right. Well, then that makes sense.
And that's what Agrippa tells us in the 3 books.
Okay.
That's what
All
you
right.
have. That's what you have some indication of, some loose indication of in the writings of Marsilio Ficino. You have that in a host of treatises where they say, if you wish to appeal to the sun, do this. They're not telling you in bullet form or enumerated practice like in a book you might pick up, or some PDF you get from, or not even a PDF, just a website. Step 1, step 2, step 3. No, they're telling you this is what you do, and you're hopefully smart enough to figure it out. Or if you can't, then you're just going to stay at it long enough until you do figure it out. It's not that complicated, a lot of it. So this idea of what is authentic is irrelevant to me. The question is, where did it come from? How do I do it? What can I expect from it? And where's an example of its efficacy, if possible?
I like it. All right. Well, I think I got one last question for you. So, Joseph Liszewski.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
The Magical World of Joseph Liszewski.
Yeah.
Could you maybe touch briefly on his background? And then I wanted to kind of hone in on his interest and work with time travel in particular. Any information you could share, that would be fascinating to me.
Well, did you read the book?
I didn't. No, I just heard you mention it in another interview that you did with somebody.
Yeah, it's important to read the book, that one in particular, because he is kind of a cautionary tale of, what happens in magic. He was a really interesting fellow. I enjoyed our relationship, and some people were very upset with me when I wrote that book, but more people weren't than were. And he came from hard coal country, about an hour from me. Pottsville, Shamokin, Pennsylvania. I mean, this is rough area in the 50s and 60s. And you're dealing with towns that were relatively thriving, but on the decline. Most of the men were either in World War II, Korea, or both. And they worked in anthracite mining or rail or related support industries. Hard, dangerous work. And he would go down into a mine pit on the weekends as a kid. See, when a mine was abandoned, sometimes people would take over and they'd clean out what was left of the available coal, even if it wasn't commercially viable for a family pit might exist. And his way out was he saw his magic. And he did a very famous evocation, which did happen. The evocation, which he discusses in his biographical story, the power of ceremonial magic and evocation, which was his breakout book. Although he had done some other work earlier, that was the title he was most famous for. Did happen. And I know that because prior to meeting Joe, and I'm going to say, I'd have to check the dates on this, but about 5 years or prior to meeting Joe, I met the man who he did that evocation with. He was a U.S. Army chaplain who had contacted me with regards to the Abermellon operation.
Wow.
And he told me things about his youth. And those were the same things that Joe had mentioned when we were talking. And I said, I met this guy, your friend. And I described him. I gave him his name and all this stuff. And yeah, that was him. So I know this happened. There are other stories which he talked about that people would debate, but I said, I know they happened too, because I heard about them from other people before I met him. And they were told in almost the exact same way, almost the exact same language. That needs to be understood. Now, his big claim was that operative magic had to go back to the old school ways, ceremonial magic of the grimoires. He had a loathing for what he called New Age syncretic magic. He was not a terribly good historian, so he didn't really understand some of the notions of the syncretic systems and grimoire magic either, but he was very good technically. And his reasoning behind this was that the energy that you need to put into modern magic to build an understanding of the symbols is tremendous. And he's right. You have to put a tremendous amount of time into building an understanding of what you're working with. It doesn't just happen automatically, although you can have some good beginner's luck and some good beginning experiences. You have to truly understand or have a sense of the understanding of what you're dealing with when you're doing these pentagrams, because usually Golden Dawn is what we were talking about here. Because he did know Rigardi. He was good friends with Rigardi for about, I think, 15 or more years. And someone even, a Golden Dawn specialist, even sent me copies of a letter that was exchanged between the two of them that he ended up having in his own files. So that you can spend time building up this subconscious synthesis or understanding of what these symbols mean and what they do, just as you learn an alphabet and learn a language. Or you can go the old school way and follow those directions. But his belief was you had to follow them exactly to the letter. Later on, he softened that a little bit, saying you had to dedicate yourself exactly as best as you could to it. And the reason he softened it was because he said, if you give people an inch, they take a yard. So if you tell them to use candles and you have to make it as authentic as possible, so they go get beeswax, okay, that's going to mean that the extra effort and energy they put into getting those candles is the juice that fuels the ritual. The special timing of creating the wand is the juice that fuels the ritual. Whereas in more modern ritual work, people get good experiences in the beginning because they're open to the possibilities. And then those experiences may degrade over time because they're doing the ritual rote. See, the classical rituals of the grimoires weren't meant to be done daily. They were special use only. Whereas you're doing systems of the Golden Dawn, you're doing the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram twice a day often. So it's very easy for it to become boring and rote, and therefore loses its efficacy. It also begins to degrade. We talked a little bit about that, the kind of the super saturation of psychic energy that can take place and what that means. But his specialty was, of course, old school ceremonial magic and alchemy. He knew Frater Albertus and completed the study course of Albertus. And he did it with considerable devotion and personal sacrifice, extreme sacrifice, to get it done. And he and Albertus, of course, worked closely. Now, Albertus was an interesting fellow who was very good at compartmentalizing things in his life. So there were other people that Albertus worked with that I knew that Joe didn't know. He wasn't familiar with them. I do understand that the entire Crowley collection at University of Pennsylvania, Penn State University, was photocopied by Joe back in the day when it was a quarter a sheet. I remember those days. You're photocopying at a quarter sheet. That'd be like a buck a sheet now, okay, instead of like 7 cents. And he photocopied the whole thing and sent it off to Rigardi at Rigardi's request. So his relationship to these men was that of a teacher-student relationship in which he would do anything for them, and did. And then eventually that became more of a peer-to-peer relationship, as it should, which is the purpose of that relationship. So he made tremendous claims about his scientific research, which were unverifiable. I did find evidence of his having a degree, a PhD, and I mentioned that in the book. However, and he did publish his thesis, and his wife's thesis on the same topic was published, which was basically the alchemical work that he had done on the archeus and the gur and the generation of life, biological generation of life through archeus and gur. And you can find that online. I don't think it's difficult to find. But his main thing was this idea that he was working on time travel. And he told me many things which were very peculiar. And often they would turn out to be true later on. I'd hear about them months later, or sometimes a year later. I believe that his personality type was so strong and so domineering that it created a near impossibility for him to play well with others beyond a one-to-one relationship. And he essentially, growing up in that environment of when he did, and spent so much time with ceremonial magic of different types. We're just touching the surface here, but the Golden Dawn magic as well, and all these other things, that a part of him wanted to essentially go back and start over. And that's what the time travel appears to have been about.
Wow. That is fascinating. And we can just leave that mystery for people to contemplate about, I guess. Mark, do you have any last messages or thoughts that you'd like to share with the listeners, or any websites you want to put out there? Anything in particular that you'd want to say, or anywhere you would like to direct people?
Well, of course, I encourage all your listeners to go to our website, the Institute for Hermetic Studies, and see what we've got there, but also to go to Teachable. Go to the Institute for Hermetic Studies at teachable.com. We have a host of classes there, and some very, very good material that you're not going to find anywhere else. It's not a rehash of what you've come across before. A lot of this is very classical and traditional. We have several courses on traditional German folk magic, which I'm familiar with. And that would be, that kind of magic that we were talking about earlier in terms of the grimoires and the ceremonial magic of the Agrippa and all those things. And to really go there and take a look at what we've got. We've got a free course, Unfolding the Rose. You can sign up for it, and it's 6 hours of coursework. And hopefully you'll like it so much, and it's free, that you'll sign up for the other courses that we've got. And you'll go through them and you'll finish them, and that you'll get tremendous benefit from them. And that they'll help you make your life better, and those of your family and anyone else that you know. And again, keep you moving along on this path. So that's where I'd like you to go.
All right. Well, this has been a joy. I'm grateful for your time tonight. And yeah, so thank you, Mark. Really looking forward to putting this out there for people. So.
Well, thank you very much. It was great to be here.